welcome to back Zelo. And in the last part I worked on something. In the last part I worked on the implementation of the new weapon archetype, that being the very big axe, and in this part I work on enemy launching and knockback. A system to put away and pull out your current weaponry, some new attack animations, and maybe some new weapon visuals like a weapon trail mayhaps. The first thing I did was weapon unsheathing and also weapon sheathing. I will first explain what this is and then why I implemented it, because it's a specific design reason that has specific reasoning behind it, and it requires explanation as opposed to other things which I just add for the funsies. So weapon sheathing and weapon unsheathing is essentially a two-system state system. Is your weapon currently active? You're holding it in your hands, it's unsheathed, or is your weapon held in its sheathing, or it's on your back, or wherever you put your weapon where you're not using it. You're not using your weapon, it's inactive, it's sheathed. There's two reasons to add weapon sheathing and unsheathing. I mean, there's two reasons in my game why I added it. I'm sure there's other reasons in other games. The main reasoning is to add the complexity of movement. Essentially, it needs to be two states for the player. Do they have their weapon drawn and are actively trying to attack things? Or do they have their weapon not drawn and are doing other things like moving around the scenery or the world? This differentiation doesn't really need to be especially present in some weaponry, like a small dagger where it would just be held in your hand, but if you're looking around a giant axe, it's a bit more obvious that the player would have a different moveset. It's very difficult to sort of convey the fact that the player is going from holding a big axe to then wall running with the same axe just in their hand, flopping about. So the weapon sheathing has to be essentially, you put your weapon away, you can do other things. It also makes the complexity of movement a bit easier. Is your weapon drawn? Then you probably can't wall run, and if you are doing certain actions, you'd have to put your weapon away, like using an item. There's a weapon in both of your hands, you can't really use an item. The item needs, the weaponry needs to be put away so you could use an item. For example, that is one of many examples. The second reason, and I lied, there's actually 3 reasons. The second reason is because I have a bunch of animations for swimming and wall running and doing other such things, but none of them are conveyed very well with you using a weapon in your hands. So if I was to go wall running while holding a giant axe, the axe would clip into the wall, which now means that I would have to reanimate everything for every individual weapon type, which realistically isn't too big of a deal. It's just moving the hands around until the weapon doesn't clip on specific keyframes, so it's not an especially huge hassle. It's more of a tedious sort of thing, but also the animations wouldn't really convey themselves very well. You may be able to tell the current running animation because it hasn't been updated for the weapon drawing. I'll get onto that part. The current running animation doesn't really look good for the axe in your hand. It just sort of looks like the axe isn't there and it's flopping about, and it doesn't have any weight behind it. So realistically, if I wanted to have weapon sheathing, or if I wanted to keep the weapons always drawn, I would run into the option where the animations would all have to be entirely different for every specific weapon to convey the weight of the weaponry that you're holding. And I would still run into animation problems like wall running, where the character always has their hands to the wall running, touching the wall for balance, I guess, holding onto the wall. I don't know. Or when they're ledge grabbing and they have their handies on the edge of the ledge. Things like that, where it just needs to convey the presence of your hands actually doing something and not holding a weapon. So the weapon needs to be put away for these systems, and it's just easier to have the sheathing used for this. And the final reason is that all weapons would have different mobility options. So if you are holding your weapon out, like the big axe, maybe this wasn't obvious from the gameplay, you're very clearly not going to be able to run that quickly as you currently can in the game. The idea is once you have your weapon drawn or unsheathed, it's going to affect your movement because you're going into a combat scenario with your weapon drawn and you're trying to attack things. So your weapon's drawn, you're going to have a different dodge roll because you're holding onto your weapon. If you're holding a big weapon, you may have a severely dampened dodging. You may have a bad dodge because you're holding a giant axe and you can't really maneuver out of the way very easily, or if you're holding a smaller weapon, the dodge may be replaced by a sidestep because you're moving very quickly, or your run time might be a lot slower, or things of this nature. Essentially, the current weapon you have in your hand is going to minorly or majorly affect your speed and movement capabilities because you're using a different weapon and they're kind of heavy. Some of them are heavy. And finally, the fourth reason for adding weapon sheathing, I completely lied at the beginning, there's 4 reasons, not 2 reasons. It adds more complexity of combat. Do you put your weapon away and run away from the monster at a higher move speed with the knowledge that you're going to have to pull your weapon out again, and that's going to take time to actually do and perform? Do you put your weapon away so you could strategically use a unsheath attack on the monster? Do you keep your weapon out and try to dodge and maneuver around while you still have your weapon drawn, knowing that it's implementing your speed and you can't move as easily because your weapon's drawn? It's another one of my favorite weird complexity decisions that the player must make on the fly to make combat intense and complex. And also, final reason, it makes me sound clever when I say sheath and unsheath instead of put out and pull out. Oh, I didn't really talk about how the sheathing works. The sheathing is essentially just a weapon attack. It doesn't look like it, but every sheathing or unsheathing is a type of attack based on the way I coded attack systems. Essentially, if your weapon is currently sheathed, it's put away, you're not using it. To use the weapon, any attack input will bring out the weapon unsheath attack input. Regardless of button press, if you press an attack while your weapon is sheathed, you will either unsheath it, which is just pulling your weapon out, or you will proceed to do a moving unsheath, which is just whatever attack unsheath attack is set to when you're moving and you pull your weapon out. For the big axe, the unsheath attack is a pull out and slam the weapon, so this is you very quickly pulling out your weapon, and it's also an attack system. So this method of unsheathing is an attack that you could follow up from. You can also unsheath your weapon in midair, so if you jump and unsheath your weapon, it will act as an attack. This is you pulling your weapon out and slamming down. And that's how the unsheathing works. Once you've unsheathed a weapon, it has a special attack modifier which will change the weapon state to be sheathed. You're pulled out your weapon, you're out of using your weapon, we can use normal attacks now. And then when using your weapon, in any state when we can sheath our weapon, all we have to do is hold R1 or one of the numbers on the keyboard, I've forgotten which one, and you put your weapon away. This is another attack state which has a similar system where once this attack is finished we will have the logic for the weapon being sheathed, but all this does is it puts our weapon away, or it puts our weapon away as we're moving if we're holding an input direction on the stick while we sheath our weapon. And these are coded in the same system as an attack, so they are the logic for playing an attack. They use the same attack logic as every other attack. They're very basically just think of them as attacks with different animations that don't play an actual attack sometimes, and then they pull your weapon out. The audio for these is pretty good. The pulling it out is a fun knife. The putting away is some fabric rustling and then a buckle fastening. I then worked on some new combat animations, 4 in total. I worked on the initial light string 3 and the light string 4. These are the follow-ups for our light attack, so you're just pressing the light button input, and this is the 3rd or 4th attack that is played. A attack which is called Jump Slam, which is the heavy input plus the jump input. Yep, I got that one correct. And then looking at my notes, I called this one the Cross Slam. This attack is the follow-up from the 4th light attack, Let's go over them all in order now. The first one is the light string free. This is just a very nice slash, has more weight to it, pulls your character back. Mwah! It's a big slash with your big axe. You know what you're getting in at this point. The sleight attack 4 is the recoil from this. This one is special, as I will explain, but it's just another slash. Falling for your momentum, you flip the weapon around at the beginning, so there's the initial part of the animation where your axe is turning, and then you're pushing it forward, and you're recoiling like normal. The thing with this animation is that once it has played, if you're holding down input after you make the input of this weapon, we'll transition into the cross slam, is what I called it. I should really label these terms better for the weaponry, because I'm gonna be honest, I forget them almost immediately, whatever each of these attacks is called. How does the jump slam differentiate from the jump spin slam, from the grand slam, from the heavy chop, from the small axe spin, from the heavy axe spin, from the upward slash, heavy slam, cross slam, light coil? They all sound the same. I need better naming conventions, or just descriptors. The cross slam is if you're holding your light input. This is going from the light string at, I think, frame, I want to say 38, 36 to the cross slam. So we're holding our input, we're transitioning out. Instead of the regular recoil from our light string, we're instead going to spin around on one of our feet. We're going to raise our weapon again, and we're going to slam downwards with our weapon. This is, again, you press your light input, you're holding it down instead of releasing it, and you're doing this cross slam attack. I think it looks pretty good. The transition for this was pretty difficult. I had to really make both animations look good so that the light attack, pressing it normally, would follow through and look good, or that there is a point in the light attack where you can transition out of it. I think finally it looks pretty good. I had to play around with transition timings and blending between the two animations, but overall, I like this attack. It's a little complicated to pull off, and because of that, the cross slam does quite a lot of damage, because I don't like pressing my inputs and then holding the last one. I think the fact that you have to hold the last input does make it a bit more satisfying to perform than just pressing it again, because you're holding it down, and that really accentuates the gravity behind the attack. It's a very heavy attack, and you having to actually hold the input really emphasizes this as a design for the player's button pressing. Finally, we have the jump slam, which is technically not a slam. This is you pressing your heavy input and then pressing your jump input. So this is an aerial attack. Your character jumps into the air, and then as they are still in midair, they do a slash downwards. This one's specifically interesting because it's a midair attack that isn't a slam down. Even though it's called a slam, I really need better naming. It's a jump, and then while you're in midair, you do a nice little slam. This attack is also pretty interesting. I'm probably going to repurpose the actual animation for it, not the jumping part, but the initial upwards to slam down animation for a midair attack. Probably a heavy. This is the third midair heavy attack, as well as the jump attack. But for now, it's the heavy attack plus jump. So it jumps your character into the air and then does a slash downwards. This is a bit difficult because this is a downward spiking attack, despite also being a jump attack. But I guess the explanation would be if you had a character in midair and you jumped to them and then spiked them down. So it doesn't make a huge amount of sense for the inputs, but it is a mid-air attack, so it does use the jump inputs. I guess maybe I could have a initial part of this attack that also hits the enemy upwards, so it's a attack that hits the enemy upwards and then also spikes them downwards. That would be pretty easy, actually. Oh, I should do that right now. Anyway, I like this attack. It has a nice little weight to it. It's a very interesting, unique attack. It looks good. Mwah. Good attack. Next, I worked on the logic for enemy knockback, enemy juggling, enemy spiking, enemy slamming. Basically just every single knockback or collision state that the enemy or player could be put into from an attack. The way this originally was working was that the player would hit the enemy and they would be applied a certain amount of knockback, but this didn't really work for a couple of different situations. But the main one that I will give as an example is, for example, the light coil attack, the one where you spin around and then slash the enemy, has two different attacks and then it hits the enemy. The issue with this, if the enemy already has a lot of knockback build up, or they've already been knocked back a lot and are going to be pushed back really far, is that the first attack is going to knock them back out of the range of the second follow-up 2 attacks. So because of this, I have to have different knockback collision amounts and also different knockback collision types. Meaning that knockback collision is now a state system, a substate system. An overview of the actual scripting, it's very, very simple. The enemy has an amount build up for how much they're going to be knocked around by any system, this being a launch into the air, a knock backwards, a knock to the ground, and this is just a build up of damage and push collision data. It's not tied to the actual damage of a weapon, so a high damaging weapon could theoretically have low knockback, or a low damaging weapon could have theoretically large amount of knockbacks. I haven't designed it that way, but I guess I could make a weapon that doesn't do damage but only knocks the enemy backwards. I don't really have a reason for making that, but I could. It's designed this way so that certain attacks could have a huge amount of knockback or not a lot for specific reasons of specific attacks, but it doesn't really matter for this instance because I haven't used it for that feature. So when the enemy is hit or anything is hit, this value is ticked up by the amount given to it. When the enemy is inactive or not being acted on in any knockback way, or I guess just in general, this value ticks down by the enemy recovery amount until he reaches 0 again. Once this value has been ticked up, so once we've been hit, this collision data will then check the hit direction that we were aiming to be pushed in, or the float values for the force that we wanted to be pushed in. These are once again determined by the actual attack itself and not by the weaponry damage. So, for example, a weapon, even if you're slashing towards the enemy, could theoretically push the enemy to the right, or to the left, or towards the player. From all of this information, we then just calculate what state we want to be putting this knockback into. This is all pretty simple, but to give you an example, if the knockback amount has reached a certain amount and the player is being pushed backwards, or the enemy is being pushed in a direction without any Y direction, so they're being pushed on the horizontal axis and they are being pushed upwards, this would just be a regular knockback. If the enemy is being pushed with force but the force doesn't have any direction, this is a stopped knockback, as in the player is being locked into their current positioning. This is good for multiple hit combos because you're locking the enemy into a position where they can't move away from, and you can easily follow up attacks by sticking them in their position. If the amount has a Y value, it's going to be implementing a launcher knockback. This is knocking the enemy into the air. If the enemy is already in the air, we're going to be initiating another launcher called a juggle, which is a separate kind of launcher that I will get into, but it's more aerial movement. If the Y value is negative, we're going to be pushing the enemy downwards. If the enemy is in the air, this will be a spike down, so we're going to be slamming the enemy into the ground. If the enemy is already on the ground, we're going to be spiking them downwards into the ground, so this is going to be a slam knockback state, which is technically a different type of stunning, but that's for future updates when it adds stun to the game. But it's a type of stun that would be added. And that's the basic of all the different knockback types that can be added, used in game. Each of these different knockback types are a different state system, and they all have different functionalities. Also, they have different qualifiers for how much build-up of knockback has to be built up in order to transition into these. So once again, to give an example, launching the enemy into the air could have a value of 10 needed to be launched into the air, while being pushed back could have a value of 5. If we have built up an amount of knockback force and it's gone to 6, we can only be pushing the enemy back with our attack values, and we'd have to build this build this knockback value up even higher to launch the enemy into the air. So different sort of knockback states can have a different degree that they will have to reach before we enter into them. And this makes sense because we want different sort of knockbacks to have different degrees of difficulty to be set into, because having an enemy put into a launcher position, it makes them a lot more vulnerable than just pushing them backwards. So launching them into the air should theoretically be more difficult than just pushing them. Once we have being knocked back or into one of these states, they all work in the exact same way, other than the directions and upwards or horizontal values are different, but I'll just give an overview of how they all work. They all have a specific amount of time for how long the state works in. They have a value from 0 to 1 from the max amount of sticky to 0 to 1 from the minimum amount of sticky. Sticky is how much this knockback force is affecting their movement. At 1 it's infecting their movement 100%, meaning they can't move normally. At 0 it's affecting their movement 0%, meaning they can move uninhibited by the knockback. To give an example, the pushback normally has a sticky value of its max being 1 and its minimum being 0. Once we have being knocked back normally, we will have 100% control delegated to the knockback, which will then, as the knockback is reduced in time, we'll go back to having 100% control of the player as 0 knockback, 0 sticky. We have another value of max force and minimum force. This is the same as the sticky amount. At max, once we have initialized the knockback of this type, max is the max amount of force we are being pushed in or controlled in. Min is the minimum amount of force we are being controlled in. So if it's 20, we will initially go from 20 when we are being knocked back to 0. We're going from 20 units being knocked back in that direction to 0 units being knocked back in that direction. We then have the state direction that each of these states will knock the player back into. This is individual for each individual knockback state, but for example, the knockback normal would be the direction that is being given to us. The juggle or air launchers would be upwards, the stun would be no direction, so no matter the force, this isn't going to be pushed in any direction. Pretty much just like that. It's just the direction we're being pushed in. Pretty much just the knockback regular is going to have a regular direction that could be altered. The rest are either going to be up or no direction at all. These are all read and calculated based on the time of each of our knockbacks, so all of our knockbacks will have a certain amount of time. For example, the pushback is 0.2 seconds, so all of our pushbacks altered by the force we are being pushed back is going to last roughly 0.2 seconds before we return to normal. A juggle could last for a second, so we're being pushed up and then moving down in the juggle. It's just how long each of these knockbacks take. I originally had them designed to be more physics-based, and by physics I mean air quote, not real physics, but more calculated based on force of damage and inputs and directions, which didn't really work very well. So these are more static, rigid, mathematical values based on the substate system, and I think that works a lot better because it's a whole lot easier to control and also play. Things are going to be knocked back in a more predictable manner. Now to give a brief overview of each of the different pushback types. The first is regular pushback. This is going to push your player back or your enemy back the amount that you hit them for, or the percentage amount you hit them for, they have a knockback value for, in that direction for the set amount of time. Then it's going to be reduced to 0, and the player can function normally, or the units can function normally. This one's pretty easy. It's just a push value that is being implemented to the movement scripting, overriding their movement direction and movement speed. The next is the launcher. This is pretty common for action games and fighters to have. This is launching the enemy into the air and keeping them in the air for a set amount of time. So we are moving from the ground, we're shooting upwards, we're being shot into the air, we're going to enter our recovery state from this. and then we're falling down. The Y amount is set to whatever our juggle or our launcher regular amount is, multiplied by our set amount of however this input had force for, and we're just keeping in the air for that amount of time. Once we have finished this sub-state, we'll go into the air recovery state. This is our character or unit falling from the air back onto the ground. If you hit the enemy while they are in this state or the launcher state, we'll go into the air juggle state. This is you hitting them into the air again. Any amount of damage that the unit is being dealt while they're in the air recovery state is going to go into the juggle state, in opposed to the pushback state, because we're hitting them in the air, so we're just keeping them in the air in a stun locked state. Juggling them. So this is just the same as the launcher state, but it has different values for how much time it takes and the force value for it. If you're keeping the enemy in the air, they will keep being juggled forever, and you can just stun lock them until they die. Although realistically stronger enemies will be able to break out of this easier, and I will add an implementation for the longer you juggle an enemy for, the harder it is going to be to continue to juggle them. This is continuing to hit them in the air, by the way, that's what that term means. And the longer it goes on for, maybe the less damage that will be dealt to the enemy or something along those lines. There will be a restriction, so you can't infinitely keep the enemy in the air. The spike state is if the enemy is hit in the air with a downward force. This is launching them straight back to the ground. This is the opposite of the launcher state, so we're just having a negative Y value being set to their movements. And the stun or the slam state or the lock state, where they're stuck in one position, is just keeping them in one position, with the sticky value being how much they're having to be kept in that position. So this isn't any force being acted, but it is the regular movement force being taken away from how much they can actually move. Finally, I have the updated weapon trails. Friendship ended with subtlety. Now being tacky and colourful is my best friend. I had originally said that I wanted the weapon trails to be more subtle and subdued, and I lied to you. I in fact changed my mind. I think I do still prefer more subtle weapon trails and weapon effects in games, but I think tonally, this more flashy, stylized visual for weapon trails fits the game a whole lot better, because it's already colourful and goofy and cartoonish and exaggerated, and you're holding a giant axe as your character. It's going to be really silly. I might as well play into it with the weapon visuals. So this is just a slash effect to kind of implement and show that off, kind of make it look real nice. I really like how this one turned out. The actual effect in Engine is a particle effect with just a bunch of trail renderers set to go across a curved amount. Then with multiple trails underneath this trail, visually and on a layer basis, that are just the color of the weapon. The default that I set for these, they all use the same trail, but the default that I set to these is just a blue color, but I've just changed it to the color of the weapon. So the axe is like a pinkish purple, so the trails that it makes is a pinkish purple. I actually think it really shows off the visuals for this weapon. It looks super stylish, and it makes the attacks, I guess, read a whole lot better. You're kind of seeing what direction the attack's swinging, for a reason that I will get onto, and I think it just really adds some more extra weight and force to your swing. You get the idea that it's really making this exaggerated cartoonish trail. The way weapon trails worked before was that it was a line particle renderer parented to the weapon, so as you swung it would create a trail system based on the weapon's arc animation wise. I changed it so it would be a bit more fluid and look like a slash, because when you have a trail parented to a weapon, sometimes they can have very awkward straight lines at very quick animations. So if it's just a particle effect in Engine, in space, not tied to the weapon, it can look at the whole lot more dynamic. So these are just slashes that are being created in front of the player as they swing their weapon. The way I worked this is that each weapon has a set amount of visual effects it can create based on the just the weapon object itself. Then what happens is that each attack has a array that is saying how many of these visual effects should be created and where. So it would say visual effects 4, which translates to / from right to left, created in world space, which is my code, meaning of it's created in front of the player, and then it just creates that, or duplicates the already existing trail tied to the axe, places it in front of the player, plays it, and then destroys it once it has finished. Wowzers, that sure was a good week of development. What was your favourite part? Mine was the weapon trails. The weapon trails are mostly something I did as for funsies, just because I wanted to see, test out some weapon trail effects, but I ended up liking them so much that they really were just added to the game in general. I like how they look. I think they really improved the game, is what I'm getting at. I also had fun making the knockback system. Oops! Dropped something while I said that. Originally the knockback system, as I said, was more physics based. I'm really happy with how it works more as a movement state system, as the same way of all my other movement state system. I am once again reminded that using physics and forces is always a bad idea in video games. Everything should be calculated with substate systems for all eternity. Next week I should hope to get the basic axe attacks finished, which is all of the regular attack combos, sans the axe special attacks, which is a different thing that I'm implementing, and hopefully the axe movements, so the walking animation, the idle animation, the jumping animation for the axe regularly will also be added. And then the regular logic for the movement speed based on the current weapon you have. Hopefully that will be next week. You better subscribe if you want to see it. You better like and subscribe.